My name is Sherry Kling, and I'm the director of Process and Faith. Process and Faith is a program of the Center for Process Studies, and we are a multi-faith network of relational spirituality. And so we have different events like this. Often we'll call them pop-ups, and where we'll have different topics, people discussing different things. Sometimes they're from a Christian perspective, but other times they're not. I'm just reached out to Swami Padmanabha to talk about his new book. He's a Hindu priest and looking to get him in here in the early part of next year. So anyway, but if you, now that you're in this event, you'll hear about other events that we will have coming up. We've also got regular ongoing small groups that meet. We have a Christian Process Explorations group that meets on the fourth Monday of every year. There's a Buddhist Process Explorations. There's a Christian leadership group, ongoing group, and a readings faiths around the world reading group that meets that discusses different books, usually for a period of anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. So if you go to our website and look under our offerings and events tabs, you can see what all is coming up. And also you'll get our newsletter and you'll see things listed there. And we also have a lot of resources on our website. There's sections on different faiths. We have a lectionary commentary series from the Christian tradition, but there's all kinds of resources on our site. So we're looking to help you navigate your way through faith and thinking about that from a process and open and relational perspective. So with that, let's begin our event this evening on the Death of Supernaturalism. Chad Bahl has been with us before to talk about some of his previous books, but this is his newest book, the topic of his newest book. Chad is a graduate of Northwind Theological Seminary and specializes in the study of open and relational theology. He's the author of several books. I already mentioned that, but one is called God Unbound. There's another called Deconstructing Hell. He's also got a book called Mornings with Schleiermacher. And then this book, The Death of Supernaturalism, The Case for Process Naturalism. So anyway, I think we're in for a treat tonight. So I just would like to turn it over to Chad and let him begin by sharing with us some of his thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry, for having me today. Thank you, Jared, for inviting me. And yeah, like Sherry said, this is my third time doing a process pop-up, and it's been fun every time. So hopefully we're going to have a good conversation, and really look forward to presenting you some ideas, maybe some old, maybe some new, but mostly looking forward to hopefully a fruitful discussion. As Sherry said, I am a graduate of Northwind Theological Seminary. My doctoral advisor is here on the call with us today, Tom Ward. And in many ways, he is, really the person that has mentored and inspired my theological journey for the past several years. And I owe a lot of what I've learned and what I've come to think, and the enthusiasm, the refreshed enthusiasm I have around my faith to that relationship I have with him. So thank you so much, Tom, for investing in me. But the book that I'm going to share about today is really the result of my doctoral thesis, reformulated a little bit and then formalized and published in text form. And for me, it was, as a person who has moved away from a more, not necessarily fundamentalist, but certainly a more conservative evangelical faith, it was a way for me to rethink and formulate what I would find to be a more livable, satisfying theology. In some ways, although this is called The Death of Supernaturalism, in some ways this book is less of an attempt to deconstruct an idea as it is really an apologetic for what I found to be a better way of thinking about God. So let me throw up some slides here. We'll go through 6, 7, 8 slides real fast. And I really hope to get to the bottom half of the hour where we can just kind of have a discussion. We can field some questions and go from there. So I'm going to attempt to bring up my slides. I'll introduce you with introduce or start with the proposition that we have a crisis of belief in America, and that's kind of undergirding some of my thoughts and restructuring. And belief in God in the 1960s, if you were to poll the average American, they would say they believed in God. 98% did. In 2017, that number went to 87%, and in 2000 today, Pew Research polling shows that number being 81%. Now, you might not think that's that low, but let's put it in perspective here. If we have about 350 million people living in America, the difference between 98% and 81% would be the equivalent of saying that 75 million less people in America would say that they believe in God. And that decline has happened in a very short period of time. So the questions, would be why. Now we could say that the common reasons for belief aren't necessarily that persuasive. If we ask the average person, they might say, "I believe in God because that's how I was raised." Well, the Bible proves that God is real. Is a refrain that you could often hear. Or science can't explain everything, so we have to have faith to explain that which science cannot explain. In my book, I reference, kind of the top 30 reasons that have been researched for, people believing in God. And like I say, they're typically less than persuasive if you're a true skeptic. But let me propose to you something that might be obvious, that there are a multitude of reasons why people say they don't believe in God. For theologian Marcus Borg, he would say that the issue is the concept of supernaturalism. And his quote from The Meaning of Jesus is this. He says, "Supernatural theism conceptualizes God as a person-like being out there beyond the universe." And he says, when the imagery of a supernatural theism becomes a conceptual model for thinking about God's relationship to the world, it has serious negative consequences. And he goes, for many, it makes belief in the notion of God simply incredible. Indeed, he says, and this is important, most modern atheism is a rejection of the God of supernatural theism. That's a pretty strong statement. I think the first thing that we have to do is really define what we mean by supernaturalism, because I think we can misconceptualize or we can get started off on the wrong page if we think what I'm denying is the existence of God or the experience of God. I certainly am not denying those things. In fact, my proposal is certainly a theistic response to supernaturalism. But I use the definition of process thinker David Ray Griffin, who proposes this definition. He goes, it's the idea of a divine being who can and perhaps does occasionally interrupt the world's most fundamental causal processes. So that's what we're making the claim here for. That's what we're saying is the supernaturalism that we are desiring to reject. So worded a little bit differently, maybe we could say it's the idea of a God who exists outside of the natural world, capable of reaching into the world and acting in a way that disrupts the natural order of things, exacting God's will in any way at any time. Now, if Borg's right and Griffin's right, and if I'm right about rejecting this concept of supernaturalism, and saying it's the primary cause of atheism, you can ask the question, what is it that makes supernaturalism so suspect? And I propose a few things here in my book. We'll go through them fairly rapidly. First, I would offer to you that it's fairly recent terminology. Traditional theistic cosmologies viewed God as present and actively involved in the world. that starts to shift a little bit, where Augustine in the 5th century introduces this concept of seminal natures, in which he says there are things that God does directly, and then there are seminal natures in which God has implanted within things in the natural world. So an example would be, from this seed might come a plant. From this cocoon might come a butterfly. They're results of the natural order of things, not necessarily something that God does directly. So we see a little bit of a dichotomy there, but we're not getting too far, of course. In the 12th century, though, fast forward about, 700 years. In the 12th century, Peter Lombard, now he's a bishop of Paris. He was a scholastic theologian. He wrote the famed 4 books on sentences, which became if not the major theological work of the time, taught in the seminaries of the time and popularized to a very large degree. He extrapolates this Augustinian concept into things that are within the natural world and things that are otherworldly. And again, you can see us getting away from this traditional Hebraic cosmology of everything existing as one and together. A century later, then, Thomas Aquinas starts to piggyback off of Peter Lombard in his commentary on the sentences, the 4 books on sentences. And it is here, although we can't pin down the first time the word supernaturalism is used, it's here that it really becomes widespread and popularized. He uses the concept of supernaturalism to explain many of the actions of God, that God supernaturally incarnates into the natural world. God supernaturally created the world. God supernaturally redeems us. It's this pervasive use of supernaturalism that we start to see initially and then develop in the 13th century. And in a sense, it's after Thomas Aquinas that we see the distinction that's been really indicative of God talk ever since. But that really didn't exist until about 1,000 years after the life of Christ. So we see the problem with creating such a dichotomy. And I would say that, if we can say that there are some actions that are natural actions and some actions that are God actions, well, gosh, that really creates an issue when it comes to scientific investigation. If we're going to separate the action of God from the action of the natural world, or action within the natural world, then we're going to have a whole classification of things that aren't scientifically able to be investigated. We're going to have, and not only that, we're going to have a shrinking God, because if God is the explanation for those things that science can't explain, then the more explaining science can do, the smaller inherently we see God becoming. And so we have this concept known as God of the gaps that is perpetuated when we have a supernaturalistic worldview. And I would also say that a God that can intervene from beyond nature creates a lot of problems when it comes to the problem of theodicy. And simply that is just why do bad things happen to good people? If a loving God exists and God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, all loving, then why is evil allowed to occur in this world? Certainly, we can look at it from, the personal scale or the global scale. If we see world war and genocide and Holocaust occurring, certainly that creates problems for theodicy, especially if we posit a God who can reach in to the natural order of things and shake the proverbial snow globe and cause to happen whatever God wills. Well, if God is all loving, why do such atrocities occur? And you can see that globally, but then you can also see that on the personal level, right? Sickness, cancer, murder, rape, all of the atrocities that we can think of that can happen in our personal lives or the people that are around us that occur. Well, if you have a God that can stop all that, you have to start asking yourself, what is then the reason behind those things happening? And we start having to find for ourselves greater goods behind those evils occurring. Well, God must have either caused that to happen or allowed that to happen. If God allowed that to happen, well, something more important is going to come out of it. And then for those of us who have had tragedies happen in our lives for which we can't fathom a greater good coming, wow, belief starts to become a little easier to deconstruct. And so I would propose that supernaturalism perpetuates the problem of theodicy. And certainly that's the case if we look at divine hiddenness. Many of you have heard or might not have heard of J.R. Schellenberg, but he popularized divine hiddenness. And basically what he is saying is that if there is a God that exists that is all loving, and there are also those who are seeking God truly with a true heart and with proper motivation, then there should really never be anybody that God is not able to show themselves to. So if we have an all-loving God who desires relationship and seekers who also want relationship with God, then why does God seem so hidden at times? Why are those who seek God often able to say that they can't find God or don't experience God? Certainly a God who is able to do all things at all times can appear in front of us and say, hey, here I am, believe in me. But that's often not what we see. And lastly, we have the problem of, I say the problem of biblical inerrancy. So if we have a God who is able to communicate perfectly, and in the Bible for the Christian is God's communication on paper to us on earth, then when we find issues in the biblical texts, we can ask, why the imperfections? And certainly we look at things like divine violence or God seeming to advocate for things like genocide in the Old Testament, populations being wiped out, God being angry and wrathful, things that don't comport with our idea of a loving being. Or if we even look at things that appear to be contradictions in Scripture. Well, if we look at one gospel, Jesus's robe in the Passion narratives might be one color, might be another color in another gospel. He might have been crucified at one time in one, in another time in another. His words might be different in one gospel as they are in another gospel. Issues with biblical inerrancy, for those that are really looking, are not very difficult to find. And they certainly raise great questions for those that would believe that God can supernaturally create a perfect text. So for the scientific community, it's really caused many to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, why bother with all this? It doesn't make sense. Let's just limit ourselves to the things that are easily investigatable. So they say that, all that really exists are things that are perceived through our physical sensory organisms. That's what scientific naturalism is. They posit a materialism, and they say that nothing exists beyond matter, its movements, its modifications. Okay? And as a result of that, really derivative from both of the above, they say, well, it's best to have, at least scientifically speaking, an atheistic view of things, operating as if God doesn't exist. A science that can't explore beyond sense perception and materialism certainly could not posit a divine reality. So that's been the response of the scientific community. But what if there's a middle road here? What if we can have a naturalism that rejects the supernaturalism that seemed to propagate this dichotomy between science and religion, but also embrace a worldview that makes sense of our deepest intuitions that something beyond mere modes of sense perception must exist? And in my thesis, I lean on the work of David Ray Griffin in his proposal that I've come to accept and that I will present very briefly to you, of process naturalism. And basically, he says, what if we don't take a thought process of atheism where God doesn't exist, or a thought process of maybe classical theism where God exists above and beyond and separate from the natural world? What if we have this pantheistic view of God, where all pantheism, all in God, where all is in God? God is not just up there, but is one who envelops the whole of the natural world, not intervening from beyond, but actively involved in creating, sustaining, and redeeming all of creation. Would that be a middle road that we could posit and find acceptable? And what if we observed, point two, that there is something more fundamental to that which exists than the material substances that comprise nature? So what if we had, let's take the human body, what if we have the body and say that, well, the cells are more fundamental than the body, and maybe atoms are more fundamental to the cells. And scientifically speaking, we can even research and look at the quarks that make up the atoms. But beyond that, in scientific naturalism, there's nothing. But what if we propose that there's something even more fundamental than the atoms that make up the cells, that make up the body, that make up the person? And we say that really, ultimately, it's the experiences that are the most fundamental thing of all. What if we are defined by the experiences that connect and interconnect us? Would this better encapsulate the world around us? Certainly, it would better postulate that we are relational beings, that we experience and we experience each other. And certainly God would be no exception to that. But if we had a pan-experiential view of things, then perhaps we would need to have ways to talk about those experiences. So more fundamental than that quirk is what Alfred North Whitehead would say is the most fundamental thing of all, and he would call them actual entities, or the most basic word for experience. And then apprehension would simply be the feeling of that experience, the feeling of that actual entity. So in a process naturalism, all things experience, but the physical sense of experience is just a small subset of those experiences. So let's take that and finally say, what if the most fundamental thing that we can all experience is freedom? Now, sure, freedom might be limited, and we can have conversations around that. Certainly, if you put chocolate and vanilla ice cream in front of me, I might have a bias towards one, due to my tastes or due to scarcity or whatever might be motivating me at the time. But freedom simply posits not that we have absolute libertarian freedom, but we have a real choice in front of us that we can choose one way or the other. And what if that was fundamental to the whole of the natural order of things, even God? Tom has proposed a term that I love called essential kenosis, that where God is a God of love, and that love requires fundamentally and essentially requires freedom. So if we take those 3 points and just say in sum, for the process naturalism, atheism, perhaps one extreme, and classical theism, perhaps another extreme, is replaced by a God who works within nature, experiencing and being experienced, and luring but never compelling creation towards the loving divine will. Perhaps that is something that we can grasp onto as a model and then use to answer some of the difficult questions that supernaturalism posits. So in sum, in the last 2 minutes, let's just try to solve the world's problems in about 2 minutes here. But now let's just kind of superimpose this concept back onto our 4 issues and see if it works. Certainly, from a standpoint of theodicy, a relational God, a God that envelops the world, that doesn't exist above and beyond the world, able to exact God's will in all places at all times, can love and can lore, but cannot unilaterally control outcomes. God in process naturalism is a God that would find the Holocaust abhorrent, that would find murder and sickness and illness awful. And we can view that God as a relational and persuasive God that is saddened by the occurrence of those things, but not being able to unilaterally control, is able to persuade and to love and to lure creation towards goodness. That's the type of God that process naturalism posits, and that's the type of God that really is, for me, the only reasonable, in my mind, but satisfactory, livable answer to theodicy that I have found. Scientific compatibility, great. If God can't interrupt the natural world, the world's most fundamental causal processes, then all things become subject to scientific investigation. Nothing is beyond the bounds of science. And as we learn more about science, we inherently, because God is a God of the natural order of things, we inherently learn more about God. God doesn't become this God of the gaps that becomes smaller and smaller as we learn more and more, but becomes bigger and bigger and leaves us with awe and a sense of wonder of all the greatness that God has created. Divine hiddenness, we can say, well, perhaps not, God is not hiding. God's trying, right? There are many things that we can reason that might inhibit our ability to intuit, acknowledge, and see God in a way that brings us towards a sustaining belief. And for many, we can obviously see that that's the case. But God is a God who allows freedom, and that there's a freedom to seek God and to know God, but there's also freedom to allow us to leave us in a way, or give us give us the environment in which God is not easily found. And biblicism, I think, is answered fairly easily as well, where a God who cannot unilaterally control outcomes is not someone who is going to directly control the hand of Paul or any of the biblical authors and make them dictate word for word what God wants on paper. We can see the Bible as being inspired by those who have sought and followed hard after God, but certainly we can see the human element in them. And then we can have a reasonable explanation for some of the pain points and misconceptions and contradictions that we might find in the scriptural text. So that's my proposal. That's why I think perhaps it might be time to allow supernaturalism to die, and in so allow us to embrace the God of the natural world and fall in love with the one who is naturally God. So with that, I'll hand it back over and perhaps unshare my screen and open it up to some questions and thoughts.